I still remember the sound of that winter night. The hum of the fluorescent lights above the pediatric ER, the faint whir of the heating vents struggling against Chicago's February cold. It was late, past midnight, the kind of shift where time blurs and the air grows thick with fatigue and caffeine. After 15 years in emergency pediatrics, I'd grown used to chaos, but that night, there was something different in the air. A stillness, as if the hospital itself was holding its breath. I was charting notes when the automatic doors slid open. A paramedic's voice broke through the quiet. Unconscious child, found near Lake Michigan. The boy couldn't have been more than 7, pale skin, soaked hair, and a hospital gown far too thin for the weather. No coat, no shoes. His lips were blue, but his eyes fluttered beneath closed lids, rapid movement, like he was dreaming. We placed him under warming blankets, started IV fluids, ran a rapid sequence of labs, hypothermic. But his heart rate was racing. I remember watching the monitor. The numbers didn't add up. Hypothermia should have slowed everything down. Metabolism, pulse, neural activity. Instead, his brainwave readings were spiking. Sharp bursts of energy every few seconds, as if his mind was fully awake while his body refused to follow. We worked through the motions. Warmed saline, cardiac monitoring, oxygen mask. His vitals stabilized briefly, only to dip again without warning. A nurse, Jenna murmured. He's fighting something. At the time, I thought she meant physiologically. Infection, shock, trauma. But the look on her face told me she meant something else. When I asked the paramedics for details, they said there'd been no one else at the scene. The boy was just there, kneeling by the frozen edge of the lake, his small hands resting on the ice. No footprints in the snow leading to him. No sign of anyone else around. We ran every search protocol for missing children in the area. Nothing. His fingerprints didn't match any national database. His name, we'd later learn, came from the tag sewn inside the gown. D. Harper. It was too clean, too new. The boy lay motionless, chest rising and falling beneath the sheets. His temperature refused to rise above 93 degrees Fahrenheit, no matter how much we tried. At one point, I thought I saw condensation form on the inside of his oxygen mask. Frost, where there shouldn't have been any. Hours passed in quiet tension. The monitors beeped steadily, but the energy in the room felt off, as though the air itself carried a pulse. Every time I turned away from him, I had the distinct sense that he was watching me. At 3:47 a.m., his EEG monitor, the one tracking brain activity, spiked again. A nurse gasped. The waveform pattern resembled what we'd expect from a conscious patient. But Daniel, as we were calling him, remained completely unresponsive. I leaned closer, studying his face, when a sound cut through the stillness. A faint breath, not from him, but from somewhere else in the room. I turned, but there was nothing. Just the rain against the windows and the clock ticking above the door. By dawn, he was stable enough for transfer to observation. I remember standing by the window, watching the city wake up in shades of gray. My shift should have ended hours ago, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. Something about the boy, the impossible warmth in his brain despite the cold in his veins, unsettled me. I didn't know it then, but that night would mark the beginning of the only case in my career that medicine could not explain. I've seen hundreds of emergencies. Children pulled from wrecks, drownings, seizures, near deaths. But that night, it felt like the hospital was waiting for something, or someone. And deep down, I felt it too. By morning, the hospital was awake again. The soft clatter of breakfast trays, the intercom paging doctors, the smell of coffee drifting through the hallways. Everything felt normal, except for the boy in room 214, Daniel. The child who, as of that morning, did not exist in any system. When I logged into the hospital records, his file was gone. No chart, no admission note, no electronic ID. The nurses swore they'd entered everything the night before. Vital signs, medications, lab orders. But now, the system claimed no such patient had ever been registered. Even the ambulance report had vanished from dispatch logs. I remember frowning at the computer screen, refreshing the page again and again, thinking it had to be a glitch. Our administrator, Ms. Reeves, didn't think so. She came down herself, clipboard in hand, to question the staff. "Dr. Keller, are you absolutely certain this child was brought in through the ER?" she asked. Her tone was polite, but I could hear the skepticism beneath it. To confirm, we pulled up the security footage, and that's when everything shifted from strange to impossible. The camera feed showed the ER entrance at 12:48 a.m. The doors slid open. I remember that sound vividly, but there was no one there. No paramedics, no gurney, no child. Just the doors opening to an empty night, then closing again. My colleagues exchanged nervous glances. One of the nurses muttered that maybe the boy had been dropped off anonymously, but even that theory didn't explain the vanishing paperwork, the missing ambulance call, or how the child ended up wearing a hospital gown we'd never seen before. When I returned to his room, Daniel was awake. His eyes, pale blue unfocused, tracked me as I approached. His skin still felt cold to the touch, like marble. I spoke softly, trying not to startle him. "Hey there, buddy. Do you know where you are?" No answer. Just steady breathing. the faintest flicker of recognition. Then, after nearly a full minute, he whispered, a voice raspy, distant, "Don't let her find me." The words froze me in place. "Who?" I asked. "Who are you afraid of?" But his gaze shifted past me, toward the window, as if something unseen stood there. From that moment on, Daniel's presence began to unnerve the staff. One nurse refused to check his vitals alone. She said the room felt too cold, even though the thermostat read 72 degrees. Another reported that whenever she stepped out, the boy's heart rate monitor spiked, as if his body sensed abandonment. Medically, nothing made sense. His core temperature remained at 93 degrees despite active warming. His EEG still showed irregular surges, like flashes of wakefulness, yet his behavior stayed calm, distant, as if he was waiting for something to happen. By evening, I felt a strange unease settle over me, the kind that logic couldn't chase away. I told myself it was exhaustion, maybe stress. But as I stood by his bedside, watching the rise and fall of his chest, I couldn't shake the feeling that the boy was only half here, as though some part of him was still standing by that frozen lake, and whatever he'd whispered, "Don't let her find me," had not been a plea. It had sounded like a warning. By the second night, exhaustion had settled into the pediatric ward like a low fog. The nurses moved quietly, their shoes barely making a sound against the linoleum. Daniel slept soundly, or appeared to. His monitors pulsed with a slow, steady rhythm, though his temperature still hovered unnaturally low. I told myself I'd stay late just to observe, to document any anomalies. But, in truth, I couldn't bring myself to leave the hospital. Around midnight, the first report came in from the security desk. A figure seen wandering near the west corridor. A woman, barefoot, wearing what looked like a pale coat or a hospital gown. Standard protocol required a lockdown if an unauthorized person entered the pediatric unit, so I joined the charge nurse, Hannah, to review the footage. But there was nothing. The cameras covering that hallway showed only empty space. Not a flicker, not a shadow. Still, nurses swore they'd seen her. One claimed she passed by room 214 and glanced inside. Another said she heard humming, faint, melodic, almost like a lullaby. By 3 a.m., I decided to stay in Daniel's room for the remainder of the night. I told myself it was to ensure the boy's safety, but I knew I was searching for something. Proof that this was still a world governed by reason. Daniel lay motionless, his breathing shallow. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was almost hypnotic. I pulled up a chair and began reviewing his EEG results again, trying to make sense of the spikes that appeared at random intervals. Then, just as my eyes started to blur with fatigue, I heard it. A soft, trembling hum. It was coming from the hallway. The melody drifted through the crack beneath the door, faint but distinct, the same tune nurses had described. I froze, listening. My first instinct was to check the monitor. Daniel's heart rate had climbed sharply from 72 to 110 BPM. His eyelids fluttered and his lips began to move soundlessly. I leaned closer. "Daniel, what is it? What do you hear?" His voice was barely audible, a whisper laced with fear. "She's here." Before I could respond, every monitor in the room flickered. The heart rate graph collapsed into static. The lights dimmed for 3, maybe 4 seconds, and the air itself seemed to vibrate, like the entire room had inhaled. When the power returned, Daniel was sitting upright, eyes wide open, staring into the far corner. I turned, but there was nothing there, just the empty corner of a sterile hospital room. Yet I swear the air shimmered faintly, like heat above asphalt. After that night, something changed among the staff. Nurses refused to cover Daniel's room alone. Maintenance reported unexplained power fluctuations, isolated to the pediatric wing. One orderly quit without notice, saying he'd heard breathing when he passed the locked room at dawn. I spent the following morning reviewing neurological explanations, hypnagogic hallucinations, collective stress responses, power surges affecting the monitors. All plausible, all comforting. I typed up my notes with mechanical precision. But when I reached the line in the report describing Daniel's reaction, his whispered words, "She's here," my fingers hesitated, because deep down, I knew what I'd felt in that room wasn't electrical or psychological. It was presence. And somehow, I had the unsettling sense that the hospital wasn't just a place anymore. It was listening. 2 days after the night I heard the lullaby, the hospital felt quieter. Not peaceful, but hollow, like something had left or was waiting to. Daniel's condition hadn't changed much. He was stable but withdrawn, spending long stretches staring at the window. He hadn't spoken since that night. When I asked simple questions, name, age, favorite color, he'd only blink slowly, as though my words took time to travel to wherever he was. That morning, I finalized a transfer request to pediatric psychiatry for further evaluation. Routine procedure, but I couldn't shake the guilt, as though I was passing off something I didn't fully understand. I lingered in his room longer than necessary, adjusting the monitors, checking vitals, watching his chest rise and fall. Everything was normal, almost too normal. At 10:14 a.m., I stepped out to review his chart with the attending nurse. We were gone for less than 5 minutes. When we returned, Daniel's bed was empty. The blanket lay folded neatly at the foot of the mattress. The monitor still beeped in rhythm, though the leads trailed uselessly onto the floor. I called for the nurse, my voice breaking before I could steady it. "Where's the patient in 212? Within minutes, the ward transformed into chaos. Security sealed every exit. Hallways echoed with the sound of hurried footsteps and muffled radio chatter. Every pediatric nurse, every orderly joined the search. But Daniel was gone. We combed through every possible place a child could hide. Playrooms, linen closets, treatment bays. Nothing, not even a sound. When we turned to the cameras, the disbelief only deepened. Every feed covering the pediatric wing had gone static between 10:14 and 10:16, the exact window when Daniel disappeared. 2 minutes of visual snow. Then, when the footage resumed, his bed was empty. I watched the replay again and again, searching for a glitch, a shadow, any trace of motion. All I found was a single still frame buried in the static. A faint, ghostly blur near the doorway, shaped like the outline of a small figure. I led the search myself, scouring the lower levels, stairwells, supply rooms, even the morgue. The silence of those halls pressed down like a weight. I told myself this was an abduction, that someone had bypassed security. It was easier to imagine a human culprit than the alternative. Then, outside Daniel's room, I noticed it. Tiny, wet footprints, no larger than a child's. They led down the corridor, past the nurse's station, and stopped at a window at the end of the hall. The window was open, slightly, just enough for cold air to curl through. It shouldn't have been possible. The locks were sealed from the inside. Yet, when I touched the glass, frost traced the shape of a small handprint. There was no snow disturbed below, no tracks in the courtyard, nothing to suggest anyone had ever been there. I stood staring out into the winter air, the sound of the hospital fading behind me. For the first time in my career, I didn't know what to tell my staff. There are protocols for trauma, for cardiac arrest, for the unthinkable, but none for a child who simply vanishes into thin air. Later that night, as I wrote the report, I caught myself describing the silence that followed. Because it wasn't ordinary silence. It was something else, like the sound the world makes when it's holding its breath. And I realized I'd heard that sound before. The official inquiry began within hours. Hospitals have protocols for everything, missing patients included, but no one in that building had ever seen anything like this. Administrators arrived in pressed suits, their calm professionalism a thin disguise for fear. The police followed, asking the same questions I had already asked myself 100 times. Who admitted the boy? Who signed his chart? Who last saw him alive? Every answer led to another blank space. There were no ambulance records, no parental contact, no fingerprints, no DNA. Daniel Harper, the boy who had spent 4 days in my care, didn't exist in any system. Not even in the hospital's admission logs. It was as if someone had gone in afterward and erased every trace of him. When they played the surveillance footage for me, I already knew what I'd see, or rather, what I wouldn't. Every camera on the pediatric floor flickered into static between 10:14 and 10:16 a.m. Exactly 2 minutes. Exactly when he vanished. When the image returned, the bed was empty, the monitors still blinking. But as I studied the footage frame by frame, something caught my eye. A single moment buried within the distortion. A figure, faint, barely visible, standing by Daniel's bed. Not a nurse, not anyone from the staff. Just a still silhouette, almost childlike, frozen in the static. When I showed the clip to security, they dismissed it as video artifacting. Compression noise, they said. A digital interference. But I'd seen interference before. This wasn't it. The outline had shape, proportion, presence. It wasn't a glitch. It was someone. After that, the tone of the investigation changed. I became part of it. The questions shifted from what happened to him to what happened to me. They wondered if I had fallen asleep, if I had fabricated records, if I was covering negligence. I'd been awake for 30 hours straight, so I couldn't blame them for thinking exhaustion had clouded my judgment. But exhaustion doesn't erase a person from existence. For weeks, I obsessed over the footage, the data, the vitals. I stayed long after my shifts ended, scrolling through logs, convinced there had to be something I'd missed. That's when I noticed something the investigators hadn't: the bed's motion sensors. They had continued recording subtle movement, rhythmic, human, for exactly 2 minutes after Daniel vanished. The same 2 minutes the cameras went down. At first, I thought the sensors were malfunctioning, but when I synced the data, it aligned perfectly with the audio feed from the room. And beneath the steady hum of machinery, something else played. Faint, almost imperceptible. A lullaby, the same one I'd heard that night. I told no one. Not the hospital, not the police, not even my colleagues. How could I? Who would believe a lullaby could echo through digital silence? But the next night, as I drove home through empty Chicago streets, my phone rang from an unknown number. I answered, expecting static. Instead, I heard it again, and that same slow, haunting tune. Soft, familiar, childlike. Then a voice, small and distant. "Doctor," the line went dead. I pulled over on the shoulder of the highway and sat there for a long time, the city lights blurring through the windshield. I told myself it was stress, grief, unresolved guilt, but deep down, I knew the truth I couldn't speak aloud. The patient I lost hadn't really left. 6 months passed before I heard that lullaby again. By then, I'd left St. Mary's. The official investigation had ended without resolution. The file stamped unexplained disappearance and quietly buried in the archives. My colleagues moved on. I didn't. I couldn't walk past an empty hospital bed without seeing Daniel's face. Every echoing hallway, every flickering monitor reminded me of that night. Eventually, I requested a leave of absence and relocated to Seattle, hoping distance might quiet whatever haunted me. For a while, it did. I spent my days volunteering at a children's hospice, a small, peaceful place near the edge of the city. It was quieter there, gentler. The air smelled of antiseptic and lavender, and the patients, though terminal, seemed oddly calm. I told myself I was starting over, that I was finally learning how to breathe again. Then one evening, just as I was preparing to leave, a nurse called from down the hall. Her voice trembled when she said my name. "Dr. Keller, you need to see this." In room 8 lay a new arrival, a young boy, unresponsive, admitted under emergency circumstances. His chart listed him as Eli Matthews, age 11. But when I stepped closer, the air left my lungs. The scar on his right hand, the curve of his jaw, the same faint birthmark beneath his ear. It was him, Daniel, only older. My first thought was that I was hallucinating, that my mind had finally surrendered to the obsession. But the monitors confirmed what my senses already screamed. His heart was beating, slow and steady. His body temperature dangerously low. His brain activity unusually active. The same anomalies, the same impossible readings. I ordered full diagnostics, though my hands trembled as I signed the forms. The nurse beside me asked if I was all right. I couldn't answer. I just stared at the boy, willing him to open his eyes, to prove or disprove my reality, and then he did. For the briefest moment, his eyelids fluttered, revealing eyes that didn't seem to belong to a child at all. They were older, knowing. He looked straight at me. Not through me, but at me, and whispered words that froze every nerve in my body. "You shouldn't have followed me." Before I could react, the monitors spiked. His body arched, the temperature dropping even further. Nurses rushed in, but it was already happening. The same phenomenon, the same impossible pattern. The heart rate fell to 0. The line went flat. I began chest compressions, shouting orders, desperate to save him this time. But before anyone could hand me the defibrillator, the bed was empty. Completely empty. No trace of the child. No sign of struggle. The sheets still warm, the pillow indented, but the body was gone. When the chaos subsided, I checked the hospital system. The patient file, Eli Matthews, had vanished. Deleted, as if it had never existed. I turned to my ID badge on the desk, and for a moment, I thought I saw my breath in the air. A faint shimmer of frost had formed across the plastic surface. Thin, delicate, like the trace of a small handprint. That's when I stopped believing this was just a case. It was something else entirely. Something that didn't belong in any chart or autopsy or medical record. Something that followed me from Chicago to Seattle. Or perhaps something I had unknowingly brought with me. And for the first time since that night, I felt it again. The hospital was holding its breath. It's been nearly a decade since that night in Seattle. I've left emergency medicine entirely. No more codes, no more charts, no more cold fluorescent lights. I now teach part-time at a small community college. Introductory physiology, basic clinical ethics. My lectures are quiet, my students kind. On the surface, my life looks normal again. But even now, when I walk past the mirrored glass of a lab door, I hesitate before looking in. I think about Daniel, or whoever he truly was, and how, after all these years, I still can't reconcile what I saw with what I know. Medicine teaches us to classify, to measure, to explain, to find the why behind every symptom, every anomaly. But Daniel, he wasn't a symptom. He was a question I was never meant to answer. Sometimes, when I can't sleep, I replay every detail in my head. The wet footprints, the static in the cameras, the sound of that lullaby faintly echoing through the hallways. I try to convince myself it was stress, exhaustion, some cruel coincidence. My rational mind still fights for control. But deep down, there's a quiet voice that whispers what I've always known. Some patients don't come to be treated. They come to teach, and what he taught me was humility. I've learned that there are limits to what we can observe, to what medicine can fix. There are things that move between us and through us, unseen, unmeasured, unexplainable. Some we call faith, some we call trauma, and some we just call ghosts. I never reported the full story. Not to my colleagues, not to any board, not even to my wife. There are truths that can't survive paperwork. I only ever kept one thing, a photo taken by hospital security after Daniel's first disappearance. It shows his bed, empty, the window slightly ajar. For years, I kept it tucked in the back of a drawer. Now it hangs in my office, framed beneath soft lamplight. A reminder of the line between knowledge and mystery. On colder nights, condensation sometimes forms on the glass. Once I saw something else, faint but there, a small handprint pressed against the inside of the frame. I reached out, and for just a second it felt cold. Not the chill of air conditioning or draft, but something deeper, older. I blinked, and it was gone. I don't talk about Daniel anymore. Most days, I pretend I've made peace with it. But every so often, I catch myself listening, really listening, for the sound of that lullaby, distant, fragile, like a memory that never quite fades. And when I do, I close my eyes, take a breath, and whisper into the stillness. Some children leave the hospital cured. Others just leave, fade to black.